Most people have conversations every day. I wonder how many of us think deeply about the nature of our conversations. This program will explore this dimension of the human experience. Among the questions I'll be addressing are the following. What's a good conversation? What makes one conversation better than another? Is there such a thing as a talent for conversation? We speak of people having a talent for music, for writing, for sports. Well, is there such a thing as a talent for conversation? And if there is it something most of us, if not all of us, can learn? And finally, is conversation the highest form of meaningful communication between people? Some societies in history have regarded good conversation as an art form. Historian Will Durant tells us that in ancient Athens, informed and intelligent conversation was considered to be the highest sport of civilization. What have the great thinkers in psychology, philosophy, religion, and literature said about good conversation? Well, let me give you a sampling of some of their thoughts. Henry David Thoreau talked about conversation and said this: man's noblest gift to man is his sincerity. Will Durant, whom I alluded to a little while ago, the historian Will Durant, talked about the elements of good conversation. And here is a quote from him. "That is the happiest conversation where there is no competition, no vanity, but rather a calm, quiet exchange of ideas." Novelist Henry Fielding, best known for his great novel entitled Tom Jones, has one of the characters in that book talk about how important it is to learn about people through conversation, and indeed that conversation can be the best way of learning about different kinds of people. And here is a quote from the novelist Henry Fielding. "A true knowledge of the world is gained only by conversation, and the manners of every rank of people must be seen in order to be known." Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, like Thoreau, talked about the importance of sincerity. Dostoevsky said this: "Sincerity is more important than elocution." What does it matter if someone, for example, speaks English very well, indeed speaks English beautifully, but is insincere? The French philosopher Montaigne gives us advice about words he considered to be especially important in conversation. He said this: "I hate probable truths that are presented to me as infallible. I love words that soften and moderate the rashness of our statements. Words such as perhaps, it seems to me, I think." Oscar Wilde talked about the connection between conversation and good companionship. And Oscar Wilde said the following: "Ultimately, the bond of all companionship, whether in marriage or in friendship, is conversation." And Montaigne again talks about good conversation being mental exercise. Here are his own words: "The most fruitful exercise for our minds is good conversation." And Thoreau again talks about the hollowness of insincere conversation. And here's what he has to say again about insincere conversation. "I sat at a table where were rich food and wine in abundance, but sincerity and truth were not, and I went away hungry." These people, these famous writers, raise some important questions. First, what are the characteristics of a good conversation? Secondly, what are the characteristics of a good conversationalist? Let's take the question, what are the characteristics of a good conversationalist first? Well, I think it's fair to say a good conversationalist has a curiosity about people and ideas, a genuine interest in people and ideas. A good conversationalist, for example, is interested in how other people see the world, see life, and what other people believe the good life to consist of. I think another characteristic of a good conversationalist is that he or she is a good listener. Thoreau said this about being a good listener: "The greatest compliment that was ever paid to me was when someone asked me my opinion about something and then attended to my answer." Humility, of course, is also another characteristic of the good conversationalist. By humility, I mean that one doesn't claim to know things that one doesn't know. And of course, so many of the great thinkers who have commented on the nature of good conversations and good conversationalists have said that the good conversationalist tries to avoid dogmatism. Ben Franklin, in his autobiography, talked a lot about that. He mentioned that among the words he felt we should often use in conversation are words such as "I believe," "in my opinion," "I beg to differ." But again, Franklin, like Montaigne, emphasizes the idea of trying to avoid dogmatism in conversing with other people, that dogmatism so often can be a turnoff. Also, I think it's fair to say the good conversationalist is a seeker of truth and wisdom. He or she, among other things, is interested in the art of living and learning more about the art of living, and hoping that through conversations with other people, he or she might come to a greater understanding of what the good life consists of. In other words, the good conversationalist is interested in the big picture, interested in humankind and life, versus the person who's simply nosy about other people. I think it's fair to say that nosiness is always a turnoff in conversation. Also, a good conversationalist is not as interested in being right when talking about something controversial as in finding out the truth. Ralph Waldo Emerson provides some illumination here. In one of his essays, he talks about teachers, and he comments that if a student should prove a teacher wrong about something, that the teacher should have the other students applaud the student, and if appropriate, the teacher should go over and hug the student for proving the teacher wrong. The idea is the teacher should be teaching the students that when we argue with other people, when we dispute with other people, our aim should not be so much to win the argument as to find out who's right, to find out the truth. Another characteristic of a good conversationalist is that such a person avoids being vain in conversation. Vanity and conceit turn people off. And of course, vanity can be a power trip, the idea being, I'm better than you are. And a good conversationalist generally speaks in a calm voice. The tone of voice can be so important in conversation. The famous writer Willa Cather, in her great novel, My Antonia, talks about the voice of the main character of the book, again, whose name is Antonia. And again, the writer Willa Cather describes this character's voice in the following way. Her voice had a particularly engaging quality. Everything she said seemed to come straight from her heart. And of course, one can't emphasize enough how important it is to be a good listener in order to be a good conversationalist. Professor Joseph Campbell commented on this, and here's what he said. Don't just think of what's being said, but of what's talking. But of what's talking? Malice, ignorance, pride, love. When malice, ignorance, and pride are talking in a conversation, that can take energy away from the listener. Whereas, when one is warm and affectionate and loving in conversation, that can give energy to the other participant in the conversation. So many of the great thinkers have said it can be a waste of time to speak with certain people. Voltaire said, The world is swarming with people not worth talking to. And Confucius said this: to speak to a man who is incapable of benefiting from good conversation is to waste one's words. The Dalai Lama, on the proper attitude of a good conversationalist, has commented that compassion is so important. And here are the Dalai Lama's words: if you approach others with compassion, that will automatically reduce fear and allow openness with other people. And that creates a positive, friendly atmosphere. That kind of openness, at least, allows the possibility of a meaningful conversation. So the Dalai Lama is telling us, if we wish to have good conversations with other people, approach them with compassion. In other words, the Dalai Lama says, remember, they are our fellow sufferers. And he says, if we can approach people with compassion, that can open the door to, or I should say, that can create an atmosphere of friendliness and openness. For the benefit of those tuned in late, you're watching Life, Love, and Philosophy. Today's topic is good conversation and what the great thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. Particularly, I'm focusing on two questions. First, what are the characteristics of a good conversationalist? And also, what are the characteristics of a good conversation? What is the potential downside of conversation? Well, in the Holy Bible, specifically in the book of Proverbs, verse 14, it expresses the idea that idle chatter can be a waste of time. Here are, again, words from the book of Proverbs, chapter 14. From all toil there is some gain, but idle chatter is pure loss. Gandhi, in his autobiography, says that as he grew older, he lost any interest in having an idle conversation with someone. In fact, he pointed out that he believed that it was a waste of time to engage in idle conversation, even with friends. Writer Khalil Gibran said that we sometimes speak without thinking, and therefore, he said, in much of our talking, thinking is murdered. Thoreau, on the consequences of trivial conversation, pointed out that many people lumber their minds with idle rumors and insignificant information. Indeed, Thoreau said that triviality can permanently profane the mind. Here are Thoreau's own words: I believe that the mind can be permanently profaned by the habit of attending to trivial things, so that all of our thoughts are tinged with triviality. Question: does one generally find good conversation on television talk shows? My guess is that many of the people watching right now, occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, watch some of the more popular talk shows on television. For example, shows featuring Regis Philbin, David Letterman, Larry King, Jay Leno. Let me examine for a moment what I think are some of the typical questions one might hear asked on these programs. Tell me about your latest movie. What was it like working with Tom Cruise or Madonna? How does it feel to be so successful? How has success changed your life? Was being nude in that movie a problem? What was your childhood like? Tell me that story about what happened to you on the way to the studio today. What's been the high point in your career? I suggest that if television talk shows are to improve the quality of conversation in those shows, I suggest that perhaps they should ask some questions such as the following. And again, this represents, of course, nothing more than my opinion. And let's see what you think about my questions. Instead of tell me about your latest movie, I prefer the question, what do you think makes life meaningful? Instead of how has success changed your life, I suggest this question. First a comment, then a question. Being a movie star or athlete is supposed to be quite glamorous. How would you compare the importance of what you do for a living with other jobs? For example, being a good nurse, a teacher, architect, social worker. And instead of, was being nude in your last movie a problem, I suggest the question, do you think that trying to be a good person in a world in which many people don't play by the rules is likely to make us happier or maybe less happy? Also, do you think that movie stars, singers, and athletes are generally better conversationalists than people in other occupations? Why aren't these kinds of questions ordinarily asked on television? Is it possible that most of what passes for good conversation on television is little more than flattery and self-promotion? It's interesting, by the way, to me, and I hope to you also, that families could concentrate perhaps more on good conversations at the dinner table. If families talked about important ideas at the dinner table, would that make family interactions more important? And what might families talk about at the dinner table, again, to promote stimulating conversation? Well, I think it might be a good idea for families to analyze some of what they have seen on television. For example, the typical sitcom. They might analyze some of the possible positive and negative aspects of situation comedies on television. For example, some people claim that sitcoms in the short run make people happy, but in the long run make people unhappy because they give people an unrealistic idea about how happy we can be in life. Well, again, that kind of idea might be interesting material for conversation at the dinner table. Also, parents and their children together could analyze the positive and negative aspects of sports. One of the questions that might be raised at the dinner table is this: is creativity more important than competition? And also, since we are so much exposed to advertising in our country and probably influenced a lot by advertising, it might be a good idea for parents and children to stimulate each other's thinking about how advertising influences them. For example, what are the hidden persuaders in the advertisements? In other words, what's the hook? What is the strategy the advertiser is using to try to get you to buy a particular product? Is it status, for example, or is it something else? And also, it seems to me, at the dinner table, parents and children, especially if the children are old enough to do this, people should explore politics and perhaps some of the important differences between liberals and what they believe and conservatives and what they believe. And of course, it's important that parents teach their children that when one talks about politics, it's very important to use words such as I think, I believe, and to maintain calm, quiet attitude in conversation, especially when people disagree about politics. And children should know that people often do disagree about politics. Finally, another question concerning families. Do families lose anything when they get together at the holidays and the men spend much of their time watching sports on television? What can we all do to become better conversationalists, in addition to what I've already suggested? Well, I think we can all become more aware of the nature of our conversations. And I think it might be a good idea for all of us to seek out people who are capable of a calm, quiet exchange of ideas and who can tolerate even welcome disagreements. And I think it would be helpful for us to seek out people who are more interested in ideas than small talk and gossip. And something else that I do, and maybe this might be helpful to some of you, make a notation of a newspaper article or thought-provoking TV or radio program and introduce it into a conversation you're going to have in the near future. Anytime I read anything, whether it be a book, newspaper article, magazine article, I always have a pen in hand. I'm always underlining, bracketing sentences, etc. I find this helps me to remember what I read, and therefore when I get together with friends, it helps me to remember some things that I read that maybe I want to introduce into the conversation. Maybe you will find it helpful too. Jesus and Buddha both warn us about being very careful about how we speak to other people and how we speak about other people. Jesus in Matthew 12 talks about the judgment day and the fact that part of the way in which we will be judged will depend on how we spoke to other people. Let me give you Jesus' own words. Again, this is Matthew 12. On the day of judgment, you will have to give an account of every careless word you utter. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. The Buddha also attached tremendous importance to the way in which we talk to other people. In Buddhism, there is a prescription for the good life. This prescription is often referred to as the Eightfold Path because it involves 8 steps. Among the steps, for example, to the good life are right livelihood, right effort, but also right speech. Right speech. And the Buddhists, Buddha in particular, tried to get people to think deeply about the way in which they talk to other people and about other people. By the way, must a good conversation be about an important idea? Well, it depends on what standard one uses. Some people claim that, no, you don't have to talk about an important idea to have a good conversation. There are other standards one could employ. For example, is one warm, are both parties to the conversation trying to be warm and affectionate? And are they creating a supportive atmosphere? Expressing feelings can be as important as expressing ideas. Another standard, how does one feel during and after the conversation? That if one feels good during the conversation and feels good after the conversation, some would say, well, that's an indication it was a good conversation, whether or not it was about an important idea. One can, of course, have meaningful human contact without any conversation. For example, a hug, a smile, a kiss, a touch, a tear, a letter, sharing silence with a person you enjoy being with. I have a confession to make. When I'm in Holland, I sometimes go to a cafe which is named the Small Talk Cafe. And I must admit that when I go there, I occasionally engage in small talk. And it reminds me that while the best conversations, I think, touch both our hearts and stimulate our intellects, any conversation in which people show each other genuine affection and respect is probably a good conversation. What I'd like to do now, since I have some time, is to recommend some books. And these books have more to do with my last 2 programs than with this program on good conversation, although the books I'll be recommending do address themselves in some way or another to the topic of today's program. But the reason I want to do this is that in my last 2 programs, I talked about success and what the great thinkers have claimed is a successful life, what standards the great thinkers have suggested we use to determine whether one's life is a successful one. And I didn't have time at the end to recommend some books, so let me do that right now. Among the holy books I suggest, and if you've seen me in the past, you know that I've suggested some of these books before. I highly recommend the Hindu holy book, the Bhagavad Gita. It's a wisdom book, as is the Dhammapada, Buddhist scripture, Buddhist holy book. That's spelled Dhammapada. And of course, I highly recommend the New Testament, which of course is also a wisdom book. I also recommend the Quran, the Muslim holy book. I must admit I have not read the Quran in its entirety. I've read much of it. It's been said that the Quran loses a lot in translation, and I suspect that is the case. Remember, the Quran was not originally written in English. Other wisdom books that I highly recommend. The Chinese wisdom book, the Tao Te Ching. Tao Te, that's spelled T-A-O-T-E-C-H-I-N-G. The Tao Te Ching, a very valuable book if one is trying to become a more wise person. And of course, the Analects, a book which is a recording of Confucius' sayings. It's the most reliable source we have of what Confucius taught. Again, the Analects, capital A-N-A-L-E-C-T-S. Also, I recommend essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson is considered to be a wisdom writer. And I recommend essays by Montaigne, also considered to be a wisdom writer. Emerson and Montaigne are considered to be two of the greatest writers of essayists who ever lived. I have some more books I'd like to recommend, but I see now I'm running short on time, so let me bring this to a close. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.